welcome to the CEC report for the 14th of April 2016. I'm Elisa Barwick and joining me today is CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, economic reality forces Turnbull and Shorten to copy CEC ideas, and banking insider destroys the bail-in lie. So firstly, economic reality forces Turnbull and Shorten to copy CEC ideas. Now, there's nothing more sure than when you hear talk about fast trains, there's got to be an election in the winds. And that's what we've been hearing a bit of this week. Malcolm Turnbull's been around the country talking about a Melbourne to Brisbane fast speed rail link, other regional links. It's been thrown out there, it's been discussed, etc., debated. And then on the other hand, you had the opposition leader this week, Bill Shorten, talking about the need for a royal commission into banking. Now, high-speed rail and banking reform just happen to be two of the ideas that the CEC is perhaps best known for across this country. Two of our most promoted ideas to build the nation, rein in the banks and put money towards infrastructure. So basically, you know, we are the pole of reality, and when reality bears down, what you see is that the politicians tend to move in that direction, because when elections roll around, they realise that they actually have to do something that's going to attract popular support, otherwise they're not going to come home with the numbers.
Just talking about taxes doesn't sort of cut it all the time.
Exactly. Now, speaking of taxes though, the way Malcolm Turnbull wants to build this rail system is by a new novel form of tax, perhaps not for an investment banker. It's typical of how investment bankers operate actually. He wants to use the value capture model of financing. So what is that? Well, basically it means that where you build the railroad, the value of land in the surrounding corridor region is going to rise. So like any banker, they think ahead and they see the potential value there. So they would do something along the lines of issuing government bonds against that value, promising to pay back the value of those bonds. With the extra taxes, they would actually basically tax the people that are supposedly going to benefit from this train being in the area. And they would basically monetise those taxes, securitising it exactly in the same way that banks would take mortgages as an asset and issue a security against it. So they would then speculate with that, leverage that to create more money. So on the one hand, it depends on the inflated values of the speculative property bubble, and on the other hand, it threatens to create a new bubble by creating these new securities. But how does this compare, Craig, with what we would do?
This is all, you know, there's a bit of smoke and mirrors here again, but everything the government's going to talk about, when you're talking about investment banking, when you talk about merchant banking, you're talking about speculation. So it's all based upon speculation and trying to fund something purely by speculation. You're talking about increasing land values. Well, already the government gets its cop from capital gains on land. I mean, if a company buys a property, not an individual, but a company buys a property and the land value increases, then when they sell that land value, right, the government gets a capital gains, usually the company tax rate. If an individual owns a property, say you build a high-speed rail from Melbourne to Dubbo and then continuing through to, say, Brisbane, and the land values in Dubbo go up for householders. Well, if you lived in your house for more than 2 years, currently you don't pay capital gains tax on the sale of the family home. Now, what they might say is, okay, well, from this point forward, because you're benefiting from this railroad, we're going to add we're going to actually make you pay 2% of that capital gain to the government. Right, just create zones of areas where, you know, legislate for it and say, oh, anyone within a 5 kilometre radius of the railway station here in Dubbo is going to be subject to this new tax. So whereas before this tax didn't exist, now it's been created to fund the this railway station. So it's another form of debt financing. We would do it completely different.
They're clutching at straws because they are of the mindset there's no money, we have to, you know, coax it out of somewhere.
This comes back to this. Look, right now, what people are getting brainwashed with is, and people should be really careful about this, you're getting told, oh, a government has to live within the budget like a household has to live within its budget. Now that is a complete and utter fraud. This is a barefaced lie, and any politician that says it should not be in the parliament, right? But should go and work for some other function where they're not actually running the country. Because simply the fact of the matter is there is a complete difference between governments that run a country and a household. For a start, you and I can't just go and print money. We can't decide, we want to be wealthy, we're going to create money all of a sudden. We can't do that because we are part of a society where that particular responsibility is given to government. Now, government has the right and has the ability to create the money or the credit in order to be able to fund the necessities for its economy. Things like infrastructure, absolutely crucially important. Now, what's happened is, over the last recent period, actually for quite some time, and I would say going back to World War II was the last time that we saw this under Curtin and Chifley, where they actually used the power of government to create the credit to fund the war and spent a lot of credit into the economy to build up the war fighting capability, extra manufacturing and so forth. What's happened is that responsibility for creating credit has been shifted from government and given to the private banking system, the merchant bankers. So every aspect of banking has now become constrained by the bankers. So the actual political role of government to say, well, we want to create the nation, we want to build this railroad station, we're going to create the credit to do this, we're going to build this railroad by doing this, that no longer exists. That idea doesn't even exist.
Well, because finance is no longer the servant of the common good because you put it into the hands of private bankers that are making decisions to make profit for shareholders and so forth and for themselves, rather than being in the hands of government acting for the whole.
And this idea feeds the private banking system. They have total control to create, well, they don't have total control, but they have the ability to create credit into the economy. That's what's created this enormous speculative debt bubble that we've had, because the banks have been unleashed. They've not been regulated since the takedown of Glass-Steagall. They've been allowed to do their own thing, so you have an enormous amount of credit being spent into a speculative things like derivatives and so on and so forth instead of the real economy. But the point is that when you start to hear politicians saying, oh, we've got to live within our means, that is actually an economic model for depopulation and for a takedown of the economy.
And Bill Shorten's call for a Royal Commission into banking practices, because obviously there's been a lot of scandals and so forth around the banks, so he knows that'll be popular. Of course, you know, he's not going to go to the heart of the issue, which we know, which we'll talk more about, but Royal Commissions, though they're known as royal cover-ups, have been known to backfire, and particularly in the case of the 1936 Royal Commission on Banking, Craig, it did backfire, and of course it led to, I mean, it came up as initially as a result of the fact that in the 1929-1930 crisis the government wanted to create credit to put towards public works, and the head of the Commonwealth Bank, Sir Robert Gibson, said, no, I bloody well won't do it. So it forced at a certain point to come to a Royal Commission, and it did backfire from the standpoint that even though the government of the day didn't adopt the findings ruled that the government is the supreme authority when it comes to those kind of decisions. The bank just can't say no because it's a bank. The government is the final decider. And then when Curtin and Chifley came to power, they indeed brought that method in by nationalising the Commonwealth Bank.
Yeah, well, Ben Chifley, who became the Prime Minister and Treasurer under Curtin, he actually wrote a dissenting report because he got appointed to that Royal Commission, the 36-37 Royal Commission. He wrote a dissenting report because he saw there was great deficiencies in that, of course, that Royal Commission. And basically what he said was that taking the experience of what took place in the 30s, where you had Ted Theodore, the Treasurer at that time, wanted to create £18 million of fiduciary note issues. That means creating credit without the backing of gold, because at that time you had to issue credit which was backed by gold. Now this is what banks do all the time. And many decades later, he was actually exonerated from that particular idea. It was a spot on the right thing to do, because it would have created demand within the economy, and the depression could have been actually non-existent. But Ben Chifley pointed out very clearly that when it comes to the economy, it's a question of the common good. And private banks are only interested in the private shareholders of that bank. And they're only going to act in the interest of those private shareholders, not into the common good. And therefore, that is a disaster for the economy. Whereas the Commonwealth Bank should have been issuing credit into the economy to expand and increased demand, i.e. so that people could buy things and continue to stimulate the economy, it actually had the opposite policy. It went against the wishes of the government of that day. So Ben Chifley said he actually tried to nationalise the banks for that reason, because the role of creating credit, the role of managing credit, is a government function for the benefit of all the common good, not just an elite handful of bankers and shareholders of those bankers, of those banks. So that was a really profound principle that Chifley came out. And it's one of the motivations that, in the late 40s, when he was trying to nationalise the banks, he was so committed to that principle, that the role of a government bank, the role of credit and of creating credit for the nation must be in the hands of the government. Of course, today, forget about that idea. Everything is run by the private banks.
Now, we'll talk about it more after the break, but we're also going to come to what's been happening in Europe in recent days, another bail-in, and show how this method of bail-in is not the solution. You've been watching the CEC Report, the weekly TV show of the Citizens Electoral Council of Australia. What can people do to find out more, Robert?
Well, they can get on our website, www.cecaust.com.au, or they can call our toll-free number for Lisa to order a copy of this, the Australian Alert Service, which is our weekly publication where we write up all the material we use. That number is 1800 636 432.
Welcome back to the CEC Report. Banking Insider destroys the bail-in lie. Now we're going to talk about the fact that the head of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, Neel Kashkari, has again come out poking holes in the idea that our banking system has been strengthened and everything's been solved since the GFC. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Just to set the stage firstly, this week's been quite wild in the world of high finance. There was an emergency meeting on Monday morning of the US Federal Reserve, which was unscheduled, and it was likely discussing interest rates. Their regular meeting isn't scheduled for some days yet. And then later that afternoon, the head of the Fed, Janet Yellen, had a private meeting with Barack Obama, the president, and nothing has been divulged about what occurred in that meeting. In Japan, we have a situation where the former IMF chief economist, Olivier Blanchard, warned that Japan is heading for an insolvency crisis, and as we've discussed before, they've gone to negative interest rates there. This hasn't worked.
This is where people put their money into the bank but pay the bank to have their money in there.
Yeah.
That's effectively what it is.
They were hoping that, average savers and people in Japan would take their money out and invest it, but they're just leaving it sitting in their savings accounts at 0%, because that's how great the risk is. They don't want to risk earning anything on it if they can just leave it sitting there. Now in Italy, there's been a special bailout fund that has been set up between the banks and the government, because they're so worried that if a bail-in comes, it'll have ripple effects right across Europe, that they're saying, oh, we can't have bail-in, so let's set up this special bailout fund. And then on Sunday, on the 10th of April, there was actually a bail-in that occurred in Austria. This is the first to occur under the new European regime called the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive, and it occurred to the Hertha Bank, which is the remains of the already bankrupted Hypo Alpe Adria Bank.
Can I just say, the purpose of the bail-in is to keep the banks operational at all costs. And it was interesting it was done on a Sunday, because this is what happens with the bail-in. The banks are literally closed. Usually it's Friday afternoon in some parts of the world, but because the banks are open in Europe on Saturdays, it has to happen Saturday afternoon. So they make it, the resolution authority, in this particular case of Austria, makes a decision, we are going to put this bank through resolution. And that's when these new bank bail-in laws kick in. Now, in the world, there's supposed to be these things called living wills, where the banks already predefine who's going to get the chop, what's going to get the chop. So by Sunday, they'd made this decision to bail in this bank, and consequently a number of the creditors within the bank, which you won't
Well,
want to
yeah,
go through.
the 100% of subordinated liabilities were bailed in, were confiscated, and that's basically bonds, bondholders.
Yeah, unsecured.
Unsecured bondholders. And 54% of eligible preferential liabilities were also bailed in, and that does include deposits over €100,000, which is the unprotected portion of people's deposits. But even the first category of bondholders includes things like insurance funds that invest in bonds, a lot of super funds. So this is affecting average people. But it was designated a success under the BRRD. The Austrian Financial Market Authority put out a statement saying that the measures taken form the basic structure for an orderly resolution and fully satisfy the aims of the European resolution regime, namely to guarantee financial market stability, to protect taxpayers and to bail in creditors. So somehow this is supposed to protect taxpayers, protect the average citizen.
Taxpayers, I think, are depositors. I mean, don't they have money in banks?
You'd think they would have to be.
What's the difference? I mean, you're calling them taxpayers, but on the other hand, depositors lose their money. I mean, this is what bail-in's about. You know, sleight of hand, but people, ordinary folk, have now lost their money.
I mean, it's trying to tell us that snow is black, basically. It's like the example cited in our Bail-in Australian Alert Service, which you can contact us for a copy of, where the Centre for Policy Studies in London is promoting this idea of abolishing deposit insurance altogether, so no deposits are protected. And they say on their website that this could counterintuitively lead to a far more secure environment for depositors. So, you know, how could that possibly be the case?
Well, it's not designed to be the case again, Lisa, because the intention is the entire financial system is based upon speculation. It's from a system that's designed to foment the ongoing greed of the banking system. The whole structure is flawed. The only way to get back to a real structure is to go with what we've called Glass-Steagall, which is on our website. We cover it in the Australian Alert Service all the time. But you actually have to put the idea of the common good first, that the money is subservient to governments and that it has to be controlled. And you cannot have these financial elites, as seen from the Panama Papers, you know, speculating, hiding money and using money as a weapon against countries at the detriment of the people.
Now, we'll take a quick break, but then we'll show you what Neil Kashkari had to say about this. Welcome back to the CEC report, where we're discussing Banking Insider destroys the bail-in lie. Now, the insider we're referring to is Neil Kashkari. He's the head of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. He's worked in Goldman Sachs in past job experience. He was the head of the TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which actually issued the monies of the bailout in 2008. So he's in a position to know what he's talking about, and he did an interview with CNBC, the US business channel, on the 5th of April. And we'll show you a clip of what he had to say. But he started off basically saying, look, we haven't solved the issues since 2007-08. The risk of too big to fail remains and it must be dealt with. And he's gotten quite a dialogue going around this matter within all kinds of high-level circles. So we'll watch that clip.
Neil Kashkari joins us now in an exclusive interview. And Mr. Kashkari, take a moment to respond to what Sheila Bair had to say about why you are choosing right now to be so vocal on an issue that has been at work in Washington for 8 years.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. You know, in 2011, just after Dodd-Frank was passed, I gave a speech at the Chicago Fed and I expressed some of my concerns that I thought Dodd-Frank did a lot of good, but it didn't really solve the too big to fail problem. I went back to the private sector. As you know, I ran for office, now joining the Minneapolis Fed. I've been able to work with the experts here in Minneapolis to look at what's been accomplished with Dodd-Frank and what's left remaining. More than anything, I just don't want the American people to have a false sense of security that we've addressed too big to fail, that this can't happen again. I think some of those risks remain, and we need to consider more transformational solutions to deal with this problem once and for all.
You know, I'm going to come off as a cynical journalist by asking this, but I don't mean this in a confrontational way. But why are you using the bully pulpit of the Minneapolis Fed to further this cause? I mean, yes, there's a tradition. Gary Stern was very big on this, as Sheila Bair mentioned, but there's no authority. You carry no authority. There's no regulation that you could come up with that would do anything about this. All you're doing is just jawboning around the country to talk about this issue that they've been dealing with in Washington for 8 years. Why now?
Well, if I'm not going to speak up, who's going to do it? Do you think it's okay if Congress and the American people are left with a false sense of security that this crisis can't happen again, and 20 or 50 years from now we may not be back in the same situation?
So you don't think that Dodd-Frank has gone? You don't think Dodd-Frank has gone far enough? That the capital requirements that are in place now and some of the other regulations that, by the way, people like Jamie Dimon, you know, they've often called Dodd-Frank Dodd-Frankenstein. They're fed up with the regulations that they already have to deal with. You don't think it's gone far enough?
For the biggest banks, no, I don't. Here's the key thing. Dodd-Frank has done some good. More capital, deeper liquidity, stress testing. These are all steps in the right direction. I absolutely acknowledge that. But the question is, in a stressed economic environment like a crisis, when multiple banks are running into trouble at the same time, will we actually be able to haircut bondholders and creditors? I say the answer is no. And the reason is the contagion from one bank to another bank to another bank. No one yet has figured out how to solve that contagion risk. Dodd-Frank hasn't done it. The TLAC hasn't done it. We see it in Europe with the contingent conversion debt. Those contingent conversion securities haven't added to stability. They've actually added to instability and uncertainty. We need to be honest about that.
So one of the key things there, of course, is the question of multiple banks. I mean, if there's one bank that goes down and they do a haircut like the case in Austria we just talked about, that's one thing. But if you have multiple banks running into trouble at the same time, he's raised this issue of the contagion from one bank to another bank to another bank. And he's saying, look, no one has figured out how to solve that contagion risk. I mean, we have figured it out, and it's a question of excising that risk altogether out of the banking system, taking out the gambling component.
Breaking up the too big to fail banks and bringing in the controls of the Glass-Steagall, where you separate out the legitimate commercial banking from all this high risk. What we're talking about is contagion is basically derivatives, Elisa, and there's $2 quadrillion worth of these things, and no one knows where they're going to end. Now, the G20 and others have tried to contain this risk by trying to regulate derivatives. And they've created these things called central clearing houses or central clearing parties. Now, these are where these derivatives are supposed to come together and be settled out and trying to be controlled. But in the US, and Neil Kashkari would know this, about only 25% of all derivatives traded, right, are actually going through these houses, the central clearing party. So what you've got is 75% of these instruments are just out there free to do what it wreak havoc, wreak contagion.
Yeah, no regulation whatsoever.
The only way you can deal with this is to go back to Glass-Steagall and say, look, these things are illegal. Like they were in the 1990s. No more trading in these things. They're actually illegal. Get rid of them. You know, don't pay them out with depositors' funds. The last thing is the last thing you want to do. And here in Australia, the same issue is very much on the table for our banks. They all have the same business model. Yeah. Right. They all have this. The big four have massive exposures to derivatives. You know, some $23 trillion worth in this country alone. National capital value are what our banks are exposed to in these sorts of derivatives. So
when the question of the Royal Commission came up, the government's argument was, well, ASIC and APRA and the Reserve Bank have all the powers we need. They can do that. We don't need a Royal Commission. They were even saying, you know, these three have greater powers than a Royal Commission would have. We'll just use them. But look, here's Wayne Byers, the head of APRA for one, who, you know, is thick as thieves with the Basel committees and the Bank for International Settlements that invented bail-in, and he was caught by surprise by the bank's lax lending standards. They're encouraging mum and dad investors.
Come back to the 1936 Royal Commission we talked about earlier. The views of government should prevail. If the views of government are to control and regulate the banking system for the common good, you'll have an entire different set of legislations than we have today. That's not the case today. We have a private banking system dictating everything.
Now, there's more information about all of that we haven't gotten to cover today in our Australian Alert Service, so call in for a free copy if you haven't already. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us, Craig.
Thanks, Elisa.
And tune in again next week to the CEC Report. You've been watching the CEC Report, the weekly TV show of the Citizens Electoral Council of Australia. What can people do to find out more, Robert?
Well, they can get on our website, www.cecaust.com.au, or they can call our toll-free number, Lisa, to order a copy of this, the Australian Alert Service, which is our weekly publication where we write up all the material we use. That number is 1-800-636-432.